I'm going to get started. I'm going to talk today about the Verifiers Dilemma. Yeah, actually, first, who am I? I'm Dieter Shirley. I'm the CTO of Dapper Labs. Dapper Labs is building the Flow blockchain, which will be coming out in the next few months. Of course, we're best known for CryptoKitties. And I have been working in blockchain stuff for a while. Was the original author of ERC 721. And so you could say that NFTs are pretty close to my heart. But today we're going to talk technical talk, and we're going to discuss the Verifiers Dilemma. So just an overview of what the talk will be about. I'm going to describe the Verifiers Dilemma pretty quickly, make sure that we're all on the same page about sort of what it is and what we're trying to solve when we talk about the Verifiers Dilemma. And then I'm going to describe three different ways that address this problem. So there's the forced errors, which were part of the TrueBit protocol. And we'll take a look at attention challenges, which have been described by the Off-Chain Labs team, the team behind Arbitrum. And we'll discuss SPOCs, which are actually part of the Flow blockchain and developed here at Dapper Labs. I'll talk a little bit about how you can work hard to be lazy and actually bypass each of these solutions. And then I'll talk about what a possible complete solution might be that is an extension of SPOCs and addresses the ability to work around each of these protocols. So in a nutshell, the problem is that people like to be lazy. Of course, being lazy, as any computer scientist will tell you, is a great way to be fast. And so fundamentally, what's happening is that that people whose job it is to verify the output of other nodes they want to do as little work as possible, and that probably makes them faster, and that probably makes them more efficient. And so you can think of it like this. If it's my job, if I'm the verifier, and it's my job to make sure that you do your job correctly, if you're really good at your job and you hardly ever make any mistakes, it's very tempting for me to not actually check your work and to just rubber stamp it. You can imagine a math teacher who has the savant in their class, and if I were that teacher, I would probably mark their exam at the end because I could probably just put 100 on it. I don't have to worry about, because even if they make one little mistake, at the end of the day, it's probably not going to hurt anyone. But of course, in a blockchain context, that's really quite dangerous. We're sort of depending on these systems to check each other, and if they don't check each other, then we run the risk of letting errors slip through. So this phrase "Verifiers Dilemma" actually comes from this paper, "Demystifying Incentives in the Consensus Computer," that was released in October of 2015. This paper was actually prompted by a Bitcoin fork that happened in July of 2015. And what they were describing, what we now call the Verifiers Dilemma, was not some theoretical construct that the folks in the ivory tower came up with. They analyzed and gave a name to a phenomenon that had actually occurred in the summer of 2015. So what happened was that there was a Bitcoin mining software that was available at the beginning, in the first half of 2015, and it was lazy. It basically didn't check blocks, the validity of blocks, before it started to build on them. And at first, this might sound a little crazy, but when you think about it, it's actually kind of rational. So you're a miner in the Bitcoin blockchain, and a block comes along, and you check the proof of work. You check the proof of work hash on it, and you see that it's a valid hash. Now, that's a very cheap check to do. It's very easy to do. And so the second thing you're supposed to do is you're supposed to check that the proof of work hash is correct, and then you're supposed to check to make sure that all of the transactions in the blockchain in the block are also correct. But if someone's gone to all the trouble to generate a correct proof of work hash, right, which could be, I don't know what it was in 2015, but it could be thousands of hours of compute effort. And why would they publish an invalid block? And so it's actually a pretty good heuristic. If they've gone to all the trouble to publish to find an accurate proof of work hash, you can probably just assume with pretty high reliability that the block is actually valid. And that's what this software did. So this software, and it was running for months at least, as far as I know, and that wasn't a problem. It turned out that was fine, because everybody who was going to all the trouble to generate a correct proof of work hash was also going to all the trouble to create valid blocks. And why would you generate an invalid block if you can solve the proof of work problem when at that time 25 Bitcoins was at stake? So what happened in the summer of 2015 was that there was some change to some part of the protocol. I think it had to do with signatures. But the change doesn't matter. What matters is that somebody somewhere on the network didn't update their miner to use the latest version of the protocol. And so somebody did the unthinkable thing and generated an invalid block that had a valid proof of work hash. And so all the people who were running this lazy software that didn't check the validity of the block and only checked the proof of work hash, they suddenly started building on these invalid blocks. And so you ended up with, for about a week, there was a fork in the Bitcoin blockchain. The block rate fell precipitously because the hash power was split between these two chains, and it was a real crisis at the time. And of course, it spawned this excellent academic paper that gave us that term, Verifiers Dilemma. And that was the analysis, that we're going to see this in these decentralized systems all the time, where if you know that somebody has a lot at stake to produce a correct result, and they produce a correct result with high probability or high frequency, then it increasingly becomes pointless almost for people to check their work, or it's a very low return. And if people get in that mindset of not checking each other's work, then these systems fall down, because the assumption is that all of these nodes are checking each other's work. Now, it turns out that high throughput blockchains make this problem much worse. So here we are at Ready Layer 1. We're talking, all these presentations from all sorts of high throughput new Layer 1 protocols. And almost every single one of them depends on verifiers in some way or another. So if you look at a sharded blockchain, then what you'll see is that not every node, the whole point of the sharded blockchain is that the reason that we can run this, we can get more throughput in aggregate, is that not every node is checking every single transaction. They're only checking the transactions in their shard, and maybe transactions in some other shard that's sort of close to them. And what happens in the rest of the blockchain, they just assume that there are other people that are verifying that work. On the Flow blockchain, we explicitly separate execution from consensus, and we have a relatively small number of execution nodes, very powerful execution nodes, and then we depend on a set of verifiers that are literally called verification nodes to check that work and make sure that it's correct. And as an observer of that blockchain, as a final end consumer of that blockchain, you are counting on the mechanisms within the blockchain to produce a correct result. Right now, today, we could, each of us, run our own Bitcoin node, could run our Ethereum node. I'm sure some of the attendees of the conference do so. But frankly, most of us just count on Infura being correct. They count on Coinbase having their own servers that are correct. And as these blockchains get more and more robust, and as we start to see actual loads of thousands or tens of thousands of transactions per second, the idea that any one of us could actually run our own node to verify all that, it becomes increasingly insane. And so we need to depend on verification inside the protocol in order to trust the protocol in general. And so this Verifiers Dilemma becomes even a more concerning issue. So just as context, I'm going to talk about sort of the most simple verification game you can imagine. It's pretty straightforward, right? There's someone who comes along, we'll call them a proposer, and they claim to have a solution to some complex problem. So for certain protocols like TrueBit and Arbitrum, which I'll be talking about in this talk, that might be a single large computation that happens off-chain. Within the context of a blockchain, and certainly within Flow, that might be executing a block or part of a block. But in any result, the point is that it's some complex problem that we don't want everybody to have to do. They claim they have the solution. Some number of verifiers come along and they check that the solution is correct. And if enough time passes without any verifier having flagged an error, then the proposer gets paid. On the other hand, if a verifier can find an error and prove that, then the proposer gets punished, slashed, and the verifier gets paid. Now, before we go on, there's a couple of really interesting problems that are part of this verification game that I'm not going to talk about too much. So one is sort of the details of, I say time passes, right? That phrase, time passes. What is enough time? How much time should pass? That's a really interesting discussion. If it's too long and you're slowing everything down, if it's too short, then you can potentially use a denial of service attack on the verifiers and prevent them from publishing their solution, publishing their challenge when they find an error in a time window that has been given. So those are all very interesting problems. Unfortunately, we're not going to get to talk about them today. The other thing that is really interesting and really important, and it actually is the essence of the TrueBit protocol that I do encourage you to go and learn about if you haven't already, is how do you even prove that there's an error, right? Like I make this statement, like verifier can prove that there's an error in a solution. Well, if there are two people that are given the same computation, one person says the result is 48 and the other person says the result is 72, how do you know who's correct? And that's a really interesting problem. I think TrueBit has a really clever solution to that problem. Again, it's sort of outside the scope of this discussion. We're talking about the problem of making sure that verifiers actually do check the proposer's work, and how can we encourage that? So in a nutshell, the solution to the Verifiers Dilemma is pretty simple. It's creating some sort of incentive so that verifiers will check the output of honest proposers. Now, I suppose technically this phrase should be supposedly honest proposers, or expectedly honest proposers, or something, some sort of weasel words around that. But at the end of the day, we can't know who's honest and who's not. Even you, in the terminology of Byzantine fault tolerance literature, right? Even you, with all the best of intentions, might end up being a Byzantine actor if a gamma ray hits your computer. And so there is no way for anyone to actually be honest. And so what we need to do is we need to create a system where the verifiers are actually looking at the result of every single proposer's output, even if they are morally certain that proposer is 100% correct. And so how can we do that? So we're going to look at three different proposals for how to address this problem. And the first one we're going to look at is TrueBit. So as I said earlier, TrueBit, if you go and read the TrueBit white paper, what you'll find is the vast majority of it is about how do you prove an error, given two people who found different results. And as I said, that's what TrueBit has done there. Really, really clever. That's inspired some of the stuff we're doing in Flow. But I want to focus in on just one part of it, which is addressed in section 4 of their white paper, which is forced errors. And that's the question of how do you even incentivize the verifiers to check the result of the proposers. And their scheme is very elegant in its simplicity. You just, with some probability, force proposers to make mistakes. If the problem is that verifiers only get paid when they find a mistake, and if you have an honest proposer, then there's never a mistake, and so you never have any verifiers. Well, can you just force the proposers to make a mistake sometimes? And so what TrueBit does is with some small probability, about 1 in 1,000, they have a system for forcing the proposer to publish an incorrect solution. Now, I can't remember what the exact details are, but it's something along the lines of, once you've computed the whole result, you take a look at the result and you hash it with your private key or your ID, and if those two things hash together and the leading 10 bits are all zeros, then you have to publish an error. The means of it aren't important, but it is important that it's deterministic, and that the proposer can't know that they'll be forced into publishing an error until after they have a correct result. And so the proposer has to go to all the trouble to produce a correct result. They get to the correct result, they run this deterministic algorithm. The deterministic algorithm says, oh, well, good job, you produced that correct result. I need you to publish an error instead. And so, again, details of that are all in their paper. Now, if the value of finding an error is more than 1,000 times greater than the cost of verifying the solution, then it's rational for verifiers to check all proposals. Right? So if it costs $1 for me to check, compute time, amortize over my hardware costs, et cetera, to check one of your results, but 1 out of 1,000 times I get $1,000 or $1,500, that's a pretty good deal. I'll do that all day. And so that's the situation that that TrueBit sets up. So the last piece of this puzzle is that although the proposer can't prevent a forced error, they need to be able to prove that the error was forced, right? Because you don't want to slash people for publishing an erroneous result that they were forced into. And so the way it works is that the proposer does the computation. Most of the time, they just publish the result. The verifiers check it because they don't know if it's correct or not. If it's correct, everything continues as expected, and the timeout, the challenge timeout happens, and the result is accepted. If the proposer in that small percentage of time is forced to publish an incorrect error, then presumably at least one verifier will come up and say, hey, that's wrong. And then the proposer will say, yeah, I know it's wrong. Here's the proof that it's wrong. Here's the real result. And then that real result should match what the verifiers found when they were checking the proposer's forced error in the first place. So it's a very nice solution, but it has a few limitations. So the first one is that only bonded verifiers can get paid for reporting errors. Now this is a little bit subtle, but it's actually kind of important. So in the original verifier game that we talked about, right, the proposer would publish a result. If any verifier came along and found an error, that they could get paid for finding that error. In the forced errors scheme, you can't do that, because if you just pay the first person who reports an error, odds are it's the proposer, right? It's not the proposer in the sense that it's the exact same account. It's probably a sybil of the proposer, but who knows that the proposer has produced a forced error? The proposer, right? They know with absolute certainty. And so if they have a sybil that is a verifier, then, or if there's no limitation on who can report an error and it's just the first reported error that gets paid, then of course it's going to be the proposer who claims that. And of course, that's all win for them, because in the case of a forced error, they don't get slashed. You can't pay everyone who reports the error, because then everyone produces sybils, right? If the proposer would set up 10,000 reporters, verifiers, and claim, oh, they've all an error. I found the error, and so you have to make sure that the only people you pay for finding errors are verifiers, and those verifiers need to have some sort of bond or stake, so that there's a limit to how many sybils that are reporting these errors, because one person can find an error and report it as many times as they want, so long as they're bonded as a verifier. You also can't really depend on preliminary results. So in blockchains for low-value transactions, we're all pretty comfortable with, maybe not 0 confirmations, but a relatively small number of confirmations for most transactions, because the number of times that a reorg results in a different output is actually pretty small. And so With a system like TrueBit with forced errors, it's still pretty small, right? Like it's 1 in 1,000 at a minimum, but that's actually quite a bit more than a simple transfer, than the probability of a simple transfer operation on Bitcoin or Ethereum going wrong because of a reorg. And so when a TrueBit proposer comes out and says this is the result, it's actually pretty dangerous to depend on that. And so you know, because you know that there's at least there's a minimum chance of error. There's not a maximum chance of error. And so it's a little bit problematic. And then as a verifier, income is a little bit spiky. It's much better than in the original verifier game, where in the presence of honest proposers, you didn't get paid at all. But it does mean that, you know, most of the time you're verifying work and not getting paid. And so if it is the case that, you know, on average, there are thousands of jobs per week that as a verifier you're part of, then that spikiness is probably not a problem. If on average there are hundreds of jobs per week, then maybe the fact that you only get paid on average 1 out of 1,000 times is potentially problematic. So the next system I'm going to talk about is attention challenges, which was put together by the team behind Arbitrum, which is called Off-Chain Labs. So I've got a link to the blog post here, and I don't know, maybe I can. I don't know if I can screen. I don't know if maybe I can paste these links in at the end to the chat, but. As far as I know, this is not a part of the Arbitrum white paper. I have to apologize. I don't know how far along the implementation Arbitrum is, so I don't know if they've implemented this into their software as yet. But this blog post by Dr. Ed Felton, who's very well-known computer science researcher, describes how attention challenges work. And so all the material I'm going to give here is based on that blog post. So I'm going to describe attention challenges twice because there's a clever bit of attention challenges that that I think might make the initial description a little bit confusing. And so I'm going to describe sort of a naive version of attention challenges, and then I'll talk about how they actually work after that as a sort of variant on that. And so the simple version, the naive version, would be as follows. So instead of the proposer publishing the result, all they publish is a signed commitment. So they take they compute the result. Let's say that they come up with the answer 67, and they, rather than publishing 67, they take that number 67, they hash it together with some random value, and then they publish that commitment in some public place like a blockchain. And now the verifiers know that the proposer has committed to a result, even though they haven't revealed the result. And so now the verifiers, they reproduce that same computation, and then they also publish commitments. And then after some delay, then everyone reveals their results. And assuming that everyone's results match, they all get paid. Now, again, as I said in the beginning, what do you do if the results don't match, and how do the challenges work? We're not going to talk about that here. But more or less, we can talk about the happy path of, everyone reveals. If there is a difference, there is, of course, some mechanism whereby the two results are compared, and ultimately one of the two different results, the proposer that is correct and the verifier gets slashed, could be the verifier that's correct and the proposer gets slashed. But regardless, the point is that they reveal their results after everyone has made that commitment. And what's interesting about this is that you can then pay the verifiers for every correct result they do. So remember, we said the fundamental way of solving the verifiers challenge was to ensure that the verifiers do the computation even if they think the proposer is honest, and this system has that feature. And so a verifier, in a sense, the verifier doesn't care whether the proposer is honest or not. They get paid for doing the work themselves. So they just do the work, they publish the result. If their result is correct, they get paid. If their result is incorrect, they get slashed. So they're almost on equal footing with the proposer. in this naive version. The problem with this is that, as I just said, right, that now you have a problem, not a problem, but now you have a situation where the verifiers and the proposer are all sort of producing all of this traffic. And so in order to optimize this, this system, we have the clever version of attention challenges. So it starts out as before. The proposer publishes his signed commitment. The verifier computes their own commitment. But rather than publishing their own commitment, they do a check to see if their commitment fits some predefined pattern, and they only publish their commitment if it does. And so this works. This is very similar to how the forced errors work in TrueBit. Remember, in TrueBit, you have the proposer, they do a computation, and once they finish that computation, there's some deterministic process that says, with a small probability, you are going to have to publish an invalid result. In attention challenges, what happens is the verifier does the computation, and then they run this deterministic process that says, with some small probability, you will publish the correct result, not the incorrect result. And so what happens is, and obviously you can tune the probability of this happen, but let's assume that we're using a 1 in 1,000 probability, same as TrueBit does for its errors. So what would happen is that one time out of 1,000, the verifier would publish their result, and 99 times out of 1,000, they would still compute their result, knowing that sometimes they get paid, and presuming that they get paid, again, more than 1,000 times their own cost of doing that computation. It's still a good deal for them. And the last step is everyone who's published a commitment reveals their results, and if all those results match, then everyone gets paid, and if there's a mismatch, then somebody gets slashed and everyone else gets paid. So what do attention challenges do? Well, the good news is that attention challenges mean that anyone can report errors. And in fact, anybody can get paid for reporting errors, because we don't have the problem where we have a situation where a proposer publishes an erroneous result, but they won't get slashed for it. And so you can actually have a situation where the verifier, where yes, only some verifiers, the bonded verifiers, get paid for producing correct results, but anybody who notices an error can publish a challenge and get paid for reporting that error, and potentially resulting in not only the proposer getting slashed, but even the verifiers getting slashed. Unfortunately, attention challenges require the preliminary result is completely hidden. So we talked about a limitation on forced errors, is that you might not want to depend on a result that has a 1 in 1,000 chance of definitely being wrong. In attention challenges, that result is completely hidden. And so you have no idea what the result is until the delay has gone and the reveal step has been completed. And so there's a little bit more of a delay there. And it still has the problem that the verifier income could be spiky if that probability is very low, and if the number of computations is relatively small. So the final technique I'm going to talk about for addressing the Verifiers Dilemma is the one that we developed for the Flow blockchain. We call these specialized proofs of confidential knowledge, which we call SPOCs for short. And these are described briefly in section 3 of our technical papers. We actually have a new formulation of them coming up in the next few weeks that's based on bilinear mappings, same basis as BLS signatures. I'm going to describe SPOCs as originally formulated in these technical papers. The new formulation has many of the same properties, but it's a little bit harder to understand if you're not deep into cryptography. So I'm gonna describe the old formulation. Most of the properties are the same. The new formulation is just a little bit more efficient and a little bit more compact. So and slightly more secure. But if you're into that, I hope you'll read our paper, which, as I said, should be coming out pretty shortly. So you need a little bit of background information to understand SPOCs. And one is this idea of an execution trace, what we call an execution trace. And an execution trace is anything that is trivially generated as a side effect of doing some computation, but which would be very difficult or impossible to recreate without doing the computation. So an example of an execution trace, and this is a toy example, this isn't necessarily what you would do, but if you were to define execution as being a variable substitution, and you'll see I've got the quadratic formula on the left there, so I've got the basic form of it, b, plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a, and then I'm replacing it with a set of values, of input values, and then reducing it, and then ending up with sort of the two answers, 3 and 1/2. And if we prescribe to proposers, right, to anyone who's doing the execution of tasks in our system, that they always follow this procedure for solving the quadratic equation, right? They write out the quadratic equation, and then they do these substitutions in exactly this order with exactly this many steps. Then what we could do is we could produce an execution trace by asking them to hash the string representation of each line of that computation. And I've got the hash of the string representation of each line of the computation on the right there. I actually did compute the hash of the string. I suppose it could just be random, but it seemed like using MD5 to generate random numbers was as easy as anything else. And so you can imagine that somebody who has the result, right? They know that the roots of this equation are 3 and 1/2. Even if they had that, they couldn't generate this execution trace without going through all of these steps. And once they've gone through all of these steps, they've done the job of a verifier. And so when I talk about execution trace, I'm talking about something of this, right? In our case, the execution trace we use is actually combining all of the state rights, right? So anytime your transaction reads or writes from the long-term storage, we keep track of that. And all of those reads and writes are combined into a hash, and that's what our execution trace is. But you can imagine an execution trace being all sorts of different things, and depending on how your execution environment works. So the way that SPOCs work is that the proposer uses the execution trace, which again is a very cheap to compute value, provided you're doing the computation, and an impossible to compute value if you only have the result. They take that execution trace and they use that to deterministically generate a key pair. So this is just a standard key pair used in asymmetric or public key cryptography, right? There's a private key and there's a public key. So they use that execution trace to generate a key pair, and then they sign a value, probably some sort of transaction ID or a computation ID or something like that. They sign a value that's related to the job they've been asked to do, and they sign it with both their private key, and then they also sign it with the public key derived from that execution trace. And they can publish that SPOC, which is that doubly signed value, along with the result, and they don't have to obscure the result. They can publish the result in the clear because they're not publishing the execution trace in the clear. And so when a verifier comes along, they can't confirm that the result is correct unless they also produce their own matching SPOC that is generated from the same execution trace. In other words, the only way to generate a SPOC as a verifier in order to get paid is to generate the execution trace. And so we need a mechanism, and SPOCs are this mechanism, for having two node operators, right, in this case the proposer and the verifier, prove to some observer that they both have the same execution trace or confidential knowledge, and they need to be able to produce a proof that specialize to them, a specialized proof of the fact that they have that confidential knowledge without leaking the confidential knowledge. So I'm going to dig into a little bit about how they work. So we assume that every node has, just a standard key pair, right? They have their own secret key, subscripted n, meaning the node's key, and they have a public key, which is well known. Then they have a process of taking the execution result and using it to generate an ephemeral key pair, which is the secret key for X execution and the public key for execution. So then they take the transaction identifier and they sign that with the node key, right? SKN, they sign that and they get this inner signature. Then they take that inner signature and then they sign it with the secret key used that that was generated from the execution trace, and that gives them the outer signature. And then the SPOC is these things, the outer signature bundled together with the execution key, the public key derived from the execution result. And so the validation process is, and I've copied the definition of the inputs of the validation, is that the observer will first check that the outer signature was signed with the public key that was derived from the execution result, and also that inner signature was signed with the node's public key. And so an observer that gets two SPOCs, it can see whether or not both SPOCs were signed with the same execution public key. And if they were, then both of the people who produced the SPOCs must have had the same execution private key, right? And that's just the general rule of what it means to have public key cryptography is that the public key can be public and you still don't know what the private key is. And so the observer knows that these two nodes that generated the matching SPOCs must have had the same secret key in order to generate the signature. And so they must have had the same confidential knowledge, but that confidential knowledge isn't leaked. So SPOCs are pretty cool, right? We can let anyone report errors. It doesn't have to be the verifiers because there's no forced errors. And so anybody who finds an error can go ahead and report it and can get anybody who claimed that result was correct slashed. The preliminary results don't need to be hidden. We can publish the preliminary results. If you believe that the execution of the proposer is honest, then you can go ahead and trust that result before the verifiers are done. Now, the only issue is that the network traffic scales with the verifier account, right? The way we've implemented it at this point in time is that every verifier does the computation and then provides their SPOCs to prove that they've done that computation. We could introduce a mechanism whereby they only probabilistically submit their SPOCs, and then we end up, with the other trade-off, which is that their income might be a little bit spiky. And so that's just a basic trade-off there. And so we really like SPOCs. That's why we're using SPOCs, is because we can safely have anybody report errors. And I think that other one, that the preliminary results are available in the clear as soon as they're computed, is actually really advantageous, because for high-value transactions, of course, you want to wait until the verifiers have checked and make sure that everything is right. But for low-value transactions, I think it's fine. And I think, and as we see in blockchains, like a 1 in 1,000 error rate would be incredibly high. In practice, they're much, much lower than that. And so, we think that SPOCs are a really great solution here. But there is a fly in the ointment: the helpful proposer. And it turns out that this fly is in the ointment of each of the schemes that I just described. And what is the problem with the helpful proposer is that each of these solutions depends on the proposer having some information that the verifiers don't. Why does the verifier check the result of the honest proposer? Because they need some piece of information that they don't have, but the proposer does have, right? In TrueBit, was that error forced? Is the result of the proposer doing their best to produce an honest result? Or is this result the proposer having published something that is known to be wrong because of this forced error? In Arbitrum, what's the actual result? as a verifier, I get paid if I can produce the actual result. And the only reason that I can't just copy that result from the proposer is because the proposer is supposed to withhold that result. In the case of SPOCs, we have this secret key derived from the execution state, but that's not a big piece of data. It's just one. It's just one cryptographic key. And so in each of these schemes, a helpful proposer, right? A proposer who, either altruistically or as a long-term con is trying to get people to be lazy, can publish this extra bit of information that allows the verifiers to be lazy and not do their job. So just to be explicit, imagine that I am a TrueBit proposer and I just flag, hey, here's my result. And by the way, there's a forced error, right? Maybe you trust me, maybe you don't. But over the course of 3 months, 6 months, if I reliably publish that error correctly, the forced error flag correctly with every result I propose, well, pretty soon as a verifier, you're like, look, if he doesn't set that flag, I'm not going to bother checking because I don't get paid in that case. When he sets that flag, of course I'm going to check it because then I get paid and I can prove the error. And there's really no downside to the helpful proposer for doing this. The helpful proposer in each of these cases has this information like as a side effect. Like it's very cheap for them to publish it. Now, of course, sort of by the formal definition of what an honest participant in the network would do, you wouldn't publish these things. And certainly, if a proposer were to start to publish this information, that would lead to some suspicion. And so, I kind of feel like it's probably not going to happen when these systems are young. But over time, you can see somebody, perhaps genuinely feeling like they're being helpful by publishing this information to make the job of the verifiers easier. So what if the proposer does publish this extra information? Well, we're kind of back where we started. The verifiers in each of those systems can look at that extra information, and based on that information, well, in the case of Arbitrum and SPOCs, they don't have to do any work. They don't have to check any result. They can just produce the information that they need to in order to get paid without doing the computation at all. In the case of TrueBit, they still do the computation, but only when they know the result is erroneous, when they're not actually providing any information to the system. And so we're kind of back to where we started. Now, it's probably not so bad for now because it requires some mechanism of coordination between the proposers and the verifiers, right? So you could imagine, you could say, well, of course there's coordination, right? Somebody could be a proposer and a verifier at the same time, but if they're literally like the same operator, well, then the system, all of these systems are sort of already broken, right? Like, why would you check the work that you yourself did, right? Like, so you might want to run a verification node and in Flow's case, an execution node to be a proposer, but not because you're going to find errors in your own work, but just because you want to participate in both of those ways and get paid in both of those ways. And so we're not that concerned about the case where the verifier and the proposer are civils, but it is problematic in the case where they're not civils, because you can have a relatively light coordination where somebody generates a new version of the node software where the proposer always publishes this information in a well-known location, and somebody generates a new version of the verifier software that looks in this well-known location, and before long we end up exactly where Bitcoin was in 2015, and people are trusting this information, and if enough people are trusting this information and depending on it, suddenly the probability that a proposer can get away with an error starts to go up. Now, that probably will take a long time. It'll probably take years for that to happen in any of these systems that I described, whether it's TrueBit, Arbitrum, or Flow, but the possibility is there. And so we kind of need to be on the search for super SPOCs. And so we have this extra information in each of these cases that is needed to generate for these systems to work is very small, right? And Arbitrum is potentially the largest one, depending on how you define execution result. TrueBit is obviously the smallest. It's literally the smallest bit of information that exists in information theory. And so But in every case, it's small enough to fit inside a single packet, and so it is kind of problematic. And so the question then is, well, what if we could create a SPOC that uses the entire execution trace? Now, you remember when I showed you that execution trace earlier, it had lots of parts to it. And this is a very simple computation. You can imagine that an actual transaction that, the CryptoKitty breeding algorithm, the execution trace for that could be kilobytes. It could be megabytes in size. And so, and executing an entire block, executing an entire complex computation, an execution trace that's on the order of hundreds of kilobytes or tens of megabytes is completely conceivable and not actually that expensive, provided that that data stays local to the execution environment. And so, is there some way that we can require the SPOC to not just depend on a secret key derived from that execution trace, but to somehow depend directly on the entirety of that execution trace? Now, it turns out that there's a similar problem in storage networks. So Filecoin and Siacoin, they've had to deal with this question of, well, we've given somebody megabytes of data and we want to know that they're storing that data. How can we challenge them from time to time to know that they really have the data we asked them to store without actually asking them to give us all the data all the time? And so I think that there's an opportunity to do some future research here where we take these proofs of retrievability or proofs of space-time and we combine them with SPOCs to create a super SPOC where the extra bit of information that you need in order to participate at, to generate your SPOC isn't just a cryptographic key. It's potentially megabytes of data that is probably more expensive to transmit over the internet than it is to actually just recompute. And then if we had that, I think we might actually have a solution to the Verifiers Dilemma. That is the end of my talk. I hope everyone enjoyed it. I have a few minutes left, so if anyone wants to type some questions into the chat, or anyone wants further explanation on anything, I would be happy to entertain that. Well, I don't see any questions, so thank you very much for everyone's time. And if you enjoyed yourself, please leave a comment in the chat. I would love to hear it. Thanks for the comment, Jim. I appreciate that.